Well, it's a delight to welcome you back, Ben, to the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group. We're discussing a really fabulous paper on the biosocial body that you've just published in Ethnos. It's about HIV visibility in an age of pharmaceutical treatment in Indonesia. And we also have two discussants with us today, Anne-Marie Samuels, as well as Ferdi Thaljib. So I think at the core of this paper, you're dealing with this profound predicament that people in Indonesia who are living with HIV are finding themselves in. They're being told to make themselves visible in certain kinds of ways to gain access to antiviral medicines. But at the same time, they're trying to be invisible in some kinds of ways. And, part of this has to do with gender identity and gender performance. You talk about basically the ways that waria, that people who, want to perform as women are being asked to conform to their cisgender by clinicians. So maybe if you could just start by kind of opening up that question of visibility and invisibility and say a little bit more about how people are navigating these competing demands.
Yeah, thanks so much, Evan, and thank you for having me again. And it's nice to be here with you all. So just a little bit of background, I guess, to how this paper came about and the kinds of relationships and ethnographic encounters that made it possible. So basically, this is based on some long-term research that I've been doing with colleagues and friends, particularly those at the Center for HIV/AIDS Research at Atmajaya Catholic University in Jakarta, Ignatius Praptaraharjo and Sandeep Nandwani, to name them, who, together with them, we've been thinking carefully about the ways in which, despite the fact that testing and treatment is supposedly widely available throughout Indonesia, and in fact, as I mentioned in the article, there's been some movement and development of basically bureaucratic policies which require even primary healthcare centers to be able to provide HIV testing and treatment. On the one hand, you've got this kind of scaling up of the availability of testing and treatment, but on the other, you have kind of an intense difficulty that people face in actually gaining access to, particularly to treatment. So what I became interested in was the role that visibility played, or the navigation of these kind of paradoxes of visibility played in shaping the possibility that basically people would test positive, and that they would then be effectively unable or imagine themselves as not be able to imagine themselves as having a future where they were successfully enrolled in treatment. And kind of continuing it on that basis. Our focus really, so our ethnographic focus was on the way in which this visibility unfolded, not only for, at the level of the individual, and that's something I really wanted to stress in this paper, is that, forms of biosociality, I think chemoprophylaxis is, Tim Dean's concept as well, often focus on the level of the individual. In fact, what we witnessed unfolding was, really dynamic forms of sociality, between what was called an MSM community, that people were actively disciplining one another into being visible in the right way, in the right settings, as a sort of method through which they could unlock treatment, or in fact, effectively discipline others into not kind of representing a liability to others within that community. So the focus that we had was really on outreach workers. So those people who previously would have, back in the 90s, been the kind of people who, got involved in community activities and safe sex education and condom, safe sex material distribution. But nowadays are increasingly kind of enrolled in these kind of bureaucratic forms of increasing testing rates and correspondingly increasing the number of people who then are retained in treatment. So kind of become part of this machinery of a more pharmaceutical model of managing HIV. So I became really interested in how they kind of acted as brokers in a way between these extant kind of sexual cultures, I call, forms of methods of navigating visibility and invisibility in sexual worlds on the one hand, and kind of these emergent biopolitical regimes involving particularly technologies of testing and treatment. On the viral load test, I mean, we can talk about this more, but viral load laboratories for assessing viral load are not widely available in Indonesia beyond the private system. So those are a little more hazy, even though they are spoken about in health policy, they're kind of not present. So it's mainly testing and treatment that were the two forms of, in a sense, visibility that I tried to contextualize in this article.
Thanks, Ben. Super interesting. I'm brimming with questions, but before I ask any more, I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Marie and Ferdy.
Should I go first, Anna? Yeah, thanks. Thanks also for starting the conversation, Eben and Ben. Yeah, I mean, it's an important work because I think it's one of the topics of visibility and invisibility, or like this idea of like coming or opening and closing, has been something that I think few scholars, anthropologists especially, are kind of like touching upon or kind of exploring in terms of how it's connected to a larger culture or cultural pattern for respect or recognition and social acceptance, basically. Within the HIV world, I think Anna's work, I think, speaks to that issue a lot, and also Tom Woolstorff, which Ben was also quoting in a paper. But it kind of also go back to, I don't know if you are familiar with the work of Thomas Todulka, where when he did his PhD with basically youth on the street in Jogja, and how they kind of like navigate this so-called what Ben was saying about this machinery through this kind of attention economy. That's what he called it, is how this youth children or this youth on the streets are kind of like speaking in a different way towards, I don't know, social services and health services and also NGOs, and how they kind of like benefit from this practice, but also restricted by it. In relationship to that, also because I'm currently exploring or developing research about living long-term with HIV, and especially aging with HIV, together in a peer-led research initiated by Positive Indonesia Network. And we just kind of, I did it because, actually during COVID, so it's mainly a virtual research through survey and interview, and how a lot of what is being said and how it is being expressed by the research participants. And it was conducted in 10 cities in Indonesia. Kind of speaks to this idea of opening and closing, or in their own terms is about what they call self-denial, which denial or accepting when it comes to one of the reasons, for instance, of non-adherence, or the reasons of not joining the treatment right away. And I'm just kind of wondering also the level of how, because all in all, I understood this also as a kind of like a psychological issue, because like they use a lot of psychologizing terms, but also from a more kind of like political economic perspective, because they speak a lot about being productive, about how it relates to having motivation to live on in the context of proving to others that HIV, people with HIV also kind of like is as healthy as others and as productive as others. You know, this kind of emphasis, and how prevalent this language is within the survey answers, and thinking also how much is it as actually a programmatic language, but how much is it also already becoming kind of like internalized as a way to answer surveys, to answer research questions, which yeah. So I don't have particular like, I just have all kind of like these hunches or feelings on how further research actually could be done towards this kind of within or among this kind of practices, which makes it even more difficult, I guess, to actually come up with new findings or new answers if basically the kind of language that is used kind of like reproducing itself. So maybe I stop there before I go too far into the discussion. And Anna, maybe you want to pick up on that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ferdy. Van, is that all right, or do you want to respond to Ferdy first?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be engaging in this conversation, and of course to read your paper, Van. That's an amazing paper, very beautifully written, and so insightful, and many, like, lots of food for thought, but also lots of it gives us a lot of tools to think about visibility and HIV in Indonesia, I think, and very important in that respect too. So you already mentioned that we talked a bit about that focus on visibility and invisibility. I think that I would want to invite you to elaborate perhaps even a bit more. And we've spoken about that before, of course. So perhaps first to briefly take it away from the context of medical and HIV. And to think with the politics of visibility, of transparency in Indonesia. And I'm thinking of the work of anthropologists like Karen Strassler, Mary Steedley, Patricia Spire, who've drawn attention to that reformasi and post-reformasi anxiety about transparency and visibility in Indonesia, right? Where you see that the urge to see, to know everything, and at the same time the fear that what you're seeing is fake, and also the fear of actual appearance, right? Of being seen, of being exposed. So there's all these interconnections. And how does that link to the urge to see HIV or to see AIDS or to see to make visible, both at the individual level and at the population level? Because one of the striking things, of course, also here in your work and Elan's work, she's there too, is that loss to follow up and the problem of adherence in Indonesia, where you also have a bureaucratic incapacity to see, in a way, right? So you get this gap of people not following up and knowing that they are out there somewhere, but it's invisible. It becomes a data gap, even from a bureaucratic perspective. So do you see that sort of that anxiety about visibility also playing out at that bureaucratic level in a way? How would you think about that? And then also what really struck me was the disclosure and non-disclosure in space in your paper, right? Even the architecture of the hospital, as you described, right? That the HIV clinic is not, there's no sign, it's hard to find, it's at the end of the hospital, and so on. And it's quite hidden, but once you get there, you're asked to disclose in multiple ways. So that's sort of like how that, like, the spaces of disclosure and the demands of disclosure was something that really struck me, and that I thought also is worth talking a bit more about that, how that works. And then let me just look at my notes, because there's just so many things. Yes, I also thought, so you talk about that sort of disciplining, right, of the biosocial body to disclose, to make visible in different spaces, and depending on the audience. And there is a certain, well, there is definitely a disciplining in that, from the outreach workers, from the hospital, like where and with whom one should do that and in what ways. And I was wondering if there's also a, next to the disciplining, a sort of like perhaps from people living with HIV, from the MSM community, a certain playfulness with that. Is there just like living up to that disciplining, or failing it, right? And I would also like to know more a bit about that failure, actually. I mean, that's also, of course, that speaks to the whole problem of loss to follow up and so on. And I think you beautifully describe that all these hurdles in accessing care and how they come with that exposure and disclosure. So I think I would like to know a bit more about the failure to perform and what that, how that happens, if you can give examples of that. But also, is there also a way to strategically play with that, right? Not fully living up to that disciplining, but do other things with the biosocial body in a way that's maybe slightly subverted, and I'm thinking also with Karen Strassler's work here on the ludic images, right, which is perhaps a stretch, but also in the terms of visibility, perhaps something to think with, how people may use that in their own ways. So yeah, I think there's more questions, but I'll leave it here, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Where shall I?
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah, your turn.
Where shall I start? Wow, thank you so much for those reflections and questions. They're really kind of, I think, helpful in guiding me to where I might draw out some aspects of the paper. For the sake of ease, I might start with the last comment that you made, Anne-Marie, about perhaps the ludic and the kind of forms of play, and I guess the relationship between play and performance, because I do paint this pretty sobering view, right, of these. I think I call them, probably, very similar to your own work, Anne-Marie, is like these paradoxes of visibility, right? Where people are kind of prompted to perform a certain kind of disclosure, often linked to outer comportment. And I do think that is, connected to historical forms of personhood that emphasize bodily cultivation throughout Southeast Asia, but forms of kind of, bodily comportment and appearance on the one hand, and being visible in a certain way, but then having to kind of maintain a certain, I guess, concealment is how it was largely framed, to be closed, right, in a strategic manner. So constantly navigating that was I don't want to kind of make light of it, because it was understood as a kind of very important and almost crucial aspect of the way in which you could sustain access to treatment. But on the other hand, there were lots of occasions when outreach workers would often say things like, "Oh, ngondek," so this kind of playful form of femininity on the male femininity. You might translate it as something like camp, right, imprecisely, but a kind of form of play that involved kind of feminine gestures, and often mimicking the style of say television celebrities, right? Celebrities. But that Ngondek offered a means to actually connect with healthcare workers in particular, to smooth the kind of wheels of bureaucracy, right? To have fun with them and to play with these otherwise, upstanding ibu, right? Or these upstanding doctors, and to kind of cajole them into participating in the kind of, forms of Ngondek as Ngondek is not just a kind of subcultural text, really. It has widespread appeal in Indonesian celebrity cultures. But obviously, MSM and the trans women who sometimes worked as outreach workers would be, a kind of a part of a kind of identifiable and identified, group of people for whom Ngondek could be a mark of contagion in most other settings. But what I thought was really interesting was this capacity to leverage, Ngondek strategically, but only in very, very particular settings, and really not in terms of the clients, but for outreach workers who, as I described them, as kind of brokers between these kinds of different communities, could then, use that to kind of leverage some appeal, right? Or entertain, in a way, is another way to put it, the healthcare workers to get things moving bureaucratically. Because after all, often these bureaucratic systems relied on relationships. And which is why these brokers were actually so important to begin with. I don't know if I quite make that clear enough in the article, but an enormous function of the outreach worker is not oriented towards the community, but towards the bureaucracy. And interestingly, Ngondek could function, despite its role as a marker of moral contagion. I give that instance of the visibility at the window looking into the clinic, where a client is kind of walking past and they slip into a performance of Ngondek because they think that's very funny. But actually, the waiting room full of, upstanding family people thought it, kind of were horrified in a sense at the kind of brashness or the explicitness of this performance. And the outreach worker was mortified by this, and they chided them for that. They kind of sanctioned them for performing it. So it certainly wasn't the case that Ngondek meant the same thing at all times. No, and indeed it could be leveraged to make bureaucracy work in a kind of interesting way.
Thanks, Ben. If anyone else has a follow-up question, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, unmute yourself. I've got one that kind of departs from that to think about the different forms of sociality that are at play here. So, we've got the biosociality that's kind of mediated by the outreach workers and the whole state clinical apparatus. I'm imagining there's kind of a chemosociality that we might describe in conversation with Anita Hardon and Tim Dean and my own recent work on chemoethnography. And then there's also what some have called kind of the biocitizenship. But I'm also wondering if kind of citizenship breaks down in some ways. I mean, in some ways they're being asked to like conform, like you must like dress different, you must like kind of embrace. There's really like kind of double speaky turns of phrase in there when they're asked to like be true to their self-identity, while at the same time they're absolutely being asked to negate parts of their self-identity. So I guess it's a roundabout way of asking, what kinds of theoretical work might we do with these different forms of sociality, these different forms of relating, like in the classic Chernobyl case, like biological citizenship is mediated by injury. You get state welfare by demonstrating injury. It seems to be different here. It's not like a whole like slew of welfare benefits accrue as a result of this identification. And I guess I'm also wondering, what does someone like Raja do after this experience? And maybe this is an ethnographic question. Like you have this humiliating experience of shame, of malu. You're having to, disclose aspects of yourself that in other contexts you're told you must keep secret. But is there a kind of sociality that emerges after an encounter like this? Like, do people like Raja go back to the club and like, share this experience with friends who've navigated similar bureaucratic spaces? Or even like in China, I describe in connection to the CRISPR HIV cure attempt, a form of sociality that's mediated by social media, where there's these meetup groups where people with the virus share strategies for dealing with the state and share strategies for making babies, even when the state's hostile to certain kinds of desires. So yeah, I guess in part it's an ethnographic question, like what kinds of sociality happens after this diagnosis, but also maybe is citizenship the right idiom for thinking about these relations?
Yeah, that's such brilliant questions, and it's making me think a lot about yeah, what these forms of sociality actually entail and look like. I think you are right in that, you know, the forms of I guess citizenship that can be claimed, in a sense, you know, they don't open people to a whole range of different resources. You know, they don't offer people, for example, the opportunity to make more money or gain compensation, right, in any kind of meaningful sense. And in fact, for the most part, I don't even think that, you know, the majority of people like Roger would actually, you know, be plugged into these kind of communities of MSM, who are in a sense the organizations that do manage to access, you know, what you could call, forms of biological citizenship, access to resources from like the Global Fund, from EPIC, you know, from USAID, these kinds of various organizations that can distribute funding and that they can capitalize on them. But I think people like Roger are framed a little bit more awkwardly in relation to that. So what I wanted to emphasize in terms of citizenship was really a relationship to not only to biological citizenship, well, however fragmented that is, or I think biosociality is probably the better term, but really state citizenship, really, and an orientation towards the benefits that come with being, warga negara yang baik, you know, in a sense, a good citizen. So, and part and parcel of that is the rollout, and Elan Laswadi knows a lot more about this than me, but the roll up of, on the one hand, universal health schemes in Indonesia. So this is the, you know, enormous investment that's been made in universal healthcare cover by the state and by regional governments, but also access to the implementation of access to testing and treatment for HIV at those healthcare clinics. So what was really interesting across, and this happened precisely at the moment I was doing that research. So what I think, you know, you could see people doing was kind of imagining or fashioning themselves in relation to kind of an emergent form of state citizenship linked to access to healthcare. That was only then in emergence, you know, it certainly wasn't well established. And so people still, as Anne-Marie mentioned before, I think approach the state and its bureaucracy with a hefty dose of skepticism as to what it could actually provide. And what was really interesting, I found with people like Roger and others that I've worked with, was this anxiety that if they were to not complete the bureaucratic tasks then and there, so, you know, this involves registration at various kind of locations around the hospital, follow-up appointments, particularly if you've got, you know, opportunity, you know, infections like TB or whatever. If you didn't do it there and then on the day, then it wouldn't happen, right? It could easily evaporate. So it was a very fragile, the state citizenship, in fact, did not seem like a secure thing at all in this guise, but quite a fragile thing that could evaporate, right, at any moment. And at the moment that you kind of left that building, that you could find yourself and indeed felt yourself to be cut adrift from it. So I think that was probably the way in which I came to see, you know, these overlapping forms of citizenship, you know, biosociality on the one hand, and then state citizenship in the other. The last one would be that of a kind of global form of pharmaceutical citizenship, right, where these people are kind of linked into, you know, an overarching narrative of the end of AIDS, right, through pharmaceutical treatment, and the kind of notion of being undetectable as your kind of end goal. Now, of course, in Indonesia, that kind of discourse, as I experienced it at the time, was not, you know, super kind of present. You know, this idea of undetectable or U equals U was certainly there, but certainly not among people, you know, really, you know, lower class folks like MSM, like Raja. but that certainly shaped the way in which Raja was imagined then as loss to follow-up, because of course the end of AIDS and its narrative is the very formation that facilitates someone like Raja to be lost to follow-up. In a sense, the flip side, or like the necropolitical of this kind of rosy discourse of the cascade of care and the end of AIDS as a kind of rosy view of access to biological citizenship through treatment. So I see a few different pathways for Raja following that encounter. One would be to, of course, continue to re-engage in state projects of public health in very piecemeal way that it's possible, and kind of tap into parallel forms of biosociality through MSM communities. Another would be to kind of go down the road, and I have seen this before, of engaging with groups, like that reject ART, right? So tolak ART is and kind of invoke this idea of the opposition to science, scientific knowledge, and medical treatment as the pathway to regaining control of your life and access to a kind of sense of recognition and belonging, by rejecting the very terms on which treatment was offered to you, in a sense, pursuing alternative forms of treatment in the form of herbal treatment and otherwise. That's one pathway. I might leave it at that.
Can I just briefly jump in to ask something about that? That's biological citizenship, because I think one of the fascinating things is that perhaps different from some of the literature on biological citizenship, here the problem is not necessarily the availability, right? The limited resources, which there are too, but the idea is that there's availability of ART for all these people, and from a state perspective, you want like all these people to actually be adhering, right? And the loss to follow up, the non-adherent, like the people who do not seek out care, that's a problem from a healthcare perspective. So how does that affect? So that then comes in the role of the outreach workers, right? So it's the idea that the outreach workers have that actually very important role in bridging the healthcare system and its like availability of care, and the people who are like supposed to be the ones accessing care and making them fit for that kind of citizenship. At the same time, one might like ask, like from a healthcare and a public health perspective, this very like these obstacles to accessibility, right? I mean that are problematic, of course. So how does that sort of idea of being a citizen, like a citizen that's like fit for accessing this care, or making that citizen fit for accessing that care, fit with a public health anxiety about people not adhering to treatment and lost to follow up. And there seems to be a bit of a tension there, which I can see in the context of Indonesia how that works, right? But there is it seems like a very important sort of outsourcing that responsibility to outreach workers.
Hi, can I say something?
Laura. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Lid.
So yeah, I think it's. I agree with you that somehow the outreach worker is become like. Initially, it's become like a good strategy because it can like become the bridge between the patient and then the healthcare worker. But I think it also provide like a short-term solution, because then the people living with HIV like rely a lot to the outreach worker to like ask them to bring the medicine, so they become like less connected with the services. And we also know that it is a fact that outreach worker is like depends on the donor, like they can like still there, the outreach worker can still work, when they have enough funding, but they're not like a sustainable system as well. So once the funding or the autistic worker is not working there, then the people living with HIV is not like familiar with the system, the healthcare system. So it's harder for them to like re-engage themselves with the healthcare provider to access like their ARV, for instance. So I think somehow the autistic workers become bridging, but it's not like a long-term sustainable solution for the lost follow-up of ART as well. I mean, that's what I thought.
Yeah, thanks, Letta. I would, yeah, I have some thoughts, but Ferdy, go ahead.
Actually, I have more a question for all of us. It's more about this concept of how this concept of biocitizenship also does it add on with, okay, we're entering, or we are having another pandemic now, which is the COVID-19, and how it adds, or does it add into the practice that is already ongoing for in context of HIV, or is it actually a whole different concept of biocitizenship that is happening, or is it like, or they are kind of like map on into each other? And maybe, because I know, Ben, that you did also research about the relationship between I mean the outreach activities during COVID, and maybe you could also expand on that a bit.
Shall I? Go ahead. Yeah, so, you know, as for that, the role of outreach workers, that's right. I think it's an incredibly, what's the word? It's an incredibly contingent role that they play, you know, and you know, as you see the rollout of, you know, I basically treatment as prevention as the focus, pharmaceuticalization as the primary aim, both in kind of national strategies and in international strategies. You see their role really shift, you know, in a kind of remarkable way. And like I said before, I can see a moment when they become effectively like, you know, just like bureaucratic number crunchers. I mean, that's already kind of happening, right? So they're integrated into these vast systems of biostatistics that facilitate something like the cascade of care, right? The cascade of care, you know, it basically counts people at these 3 steps as they move through like what's supposed to be a linear narrative, you know, testing, testing positive, enrolling in treatment, and then retained in treatment, or having a suppressed viral load, right? Those being 3 checkpoints. That requires a huge amount of labor, bureaucratic and data labor. And what I've observed is outreach workers kind of performing that alongside, you know, you see these other kinds of forms of work that previously have been or are often undertaken in parallel with what are called pendamping sebaya, peer workers, you know, or peer support workers. But actually those 2 roles are highly, the relationship between them is very blurred. Just as a side note as well, I would say, you know, what's kind of remarkable at the moment in Indonesia is that you have the rollout of schemes, of pilot schemes for PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis, in various sites in Indonesia at precisely the moment when you have kind of broad unavailability of condoms for outreach workers. So more or less condoms at the moment in Indonesia are among programs. I mean, and you can still purchase them on the private market, but access to condoms as funded, you know, as kind of part of funded outreach programs has become incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Other reports that we've heard over the past year, you know, funnily enough, kind of coming through the period of COVID with kind of talk of supply chain issues, but then just gradually kind of like fading away, you know, in light of a series of other and effectively what are bureaucratic problems with procuring condoms of a sufficient quality that the Global Fund will fund, because those condoms are not Indonesian-made condoms are not apparently at a standard that the Global Fund will pay for. But in any case, yeah, I mean, even that rearrangement, that's just a little anecdote, right? But that rearrangement suggests to you the kind of shifting emphasis and focus. What happens, I mean, I think it's the question that I always have is, yeah, and I mean, I saw this asked at a community forum the other day. You know, Indonesia has this tendency, and this is not just Indonesia, but international development focused kind of programs, including those in Indonesia, focus on expensive, you know, almost what you call them, kind of techno-utopian projects, right, of imagining a future end of AIDS. But of course, there are many people, you know, and they're expensive, so there's plenty of opportunity for corruption along the way. And I think that was the insinuation of this community, the person at this community forum. But what you see is a kind of falling away altogether of strategies like, you know, such as condoms, availability of condoms, accompanied by, you know, a rearrangement in the activities of outreach workers, right, who would previously have, like, you know, condoms available or just, you know, distribute them to the people who are the target of their programs. You know, those kinds of previous kind of systems or practices falling away, and what you see kind of emerging in lieu of it is kind of, you know, I don't know how to describe it, but you know, it's like the talk of these kinds of systems, you know, these kinds of techno-utopian kinds of systems. So all of the kind of discourse, the data, right? So you've got these nice data sets that the government is, you know, publishing every quarter on its website where they show, I mean, not great results, but they nevertheless are collecting this data and publishing it, you know, which is in itself a massive resources. But then not, you know, a kind of lack of availability of something like condoms, or a lack of availability of, you know, the ability to have efficient enough or well-oiled enough bureaucratic systems that people can actually comprehend and have faith that their status won't be you know, for example, compromised to others. So those are some kind of thoughts that I have on that kind of process. And I think we're in a very fragile moment at the moment. A lot of people have pointed this out. You have this problem with accessing condoms on the one hand. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were supply chain issues which disrupted supplies of ARTs into Indonesia. You know, and so what happens then when you have a kind of more prophylactic economy of thinking about HIV? I wonder what the next kind of move might be, or how this will be imagined possible, and what kinds of subjects of HIV prevention will be needed. Because I don't quite see there to be yet those subjects. You know, there are those subjects in formation, but for the most part, you know, people like Roger, I would say, are you know, basically poor, lower class, you know, involved in transactional sex of varying kinds are probably more numerous. Sorry, that was.
Thanks, Ben. I've got another question if no one else wants to jump in. So on page 3, you talk about MSN as a prominent bureaucratic technology, and I was wondering if an older idea from science and technology studies from John Law of the looping effects of categories might also help think through kind of the interpolation work that's happening, where, so, you know, Althusser talks about how, you know, interpolation is classically like somebody walking down the street, the cop says, "Hey, you," and you turn around. But I think, you know, what Law was trying to get at is the ways that people are interpolated into categories and then remake themselves, and then also remake the category. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the different forces that are at play as people are interpolated into that category, and how it's being remade, and how people are remaking themselves.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and not something that I looked at in kind of much detail in this paper. Of course, people like Tom Belsdorf have that well-known article on MSM, right, as this kind of, what does he call it, a proleptic category. that kind of is always haunted by its own failure to name what it's trying to name, because it's attempting to disaggregate practices from identity in such a way that is just not how people think or imagine themselves. So with the emergence of MSM as an attempt to kind of escape the both the moral and I guess political meanings of gay identity, you had the emergence of people who called themselves MSM, and indeed in translations of MSM. So in the Indonesian context, it's LSL, right? So you've got communities of LSL, people who call themselves LSL in all kinds of ways. I mean, for the life of me, I could never quite work out what the difference between LSL and gay was, because gay was a term also used in parallel, and I couldn't really locate any meaningful distinction either in terms of class or in terms of relationship to, say, HIV programs. It was a very kind of interesting split, but I did tend to see, you did tend to see formations of communities around the category gay and communities around the category LSL for people who identified as such. Again, I think what I'm interested in here is how these, shifting the pharmaceuticalization of HIV programs through treatment as prevention is I think once again kind of refiguring the kinds of categories that are being used and the kinds of binaries that are put to work in interesting ways. So of course undetectable and detectable being the one that is a kind of emergent normalizing kind of binary. Again, I think Tim Dean suggested that undetectable could kind of spin out and offer kind of a queer framework through which to think about a non-binarizing format for sexuality. But actually what's happened is that of course a reverse discourse of detectable has emerged, right, with all of the moral weight of that. So what I'm really interested in now, I guess, is thinking about how economies of access to PrEP are reshaping the kinds of categories that people use, and also may necessitate or reflect a movement away from MSM. I have seen that that MSM becomes a category that is not always as widely used, right? And people will use other terms and terminology, so link themselves into these kind of pharmaceutical regimes of HIV on the one hand, but not connect themselves or describe themselves as MSM on the other. So I think the one I mentioned in the paper was kayakini. It's really like vague, like assignation of like this, which like for public health people is like a nightmare, of course, because you're like, who are these people? And in fact, that's how, this study, in a sense, came about through conversations with people at UNAIDS who are incredibly frustrated at not being able to find these hidden populations, as they call them, right? And Raja, to me, represents a very interesting manifestation of the presence. We could call it a ghostly presence, Anne-Marie, of the invisible population. So yeah, the next step, I think, is to kind of start to think about categories that are being used, in the Indonesian context, whether as they reflect this kind of pharmaceuticalization of access of HIV programs. What happens to MSM, and then whether categories like, for example, detectable, undetectable, how they then are kind of mapped onto extant notions of visibility, terbuka and tertutup. So I don't think buka and tutup is going anywhere. I think those are really enduring concepts of personhood, and people will use those consistently, even if they won't describe themselves as MSM. So I'm interested in the next kind of iteration of this looping.
Would you see any of that happening to the category of ODA, now ODIF, as well? Like that inhabiting a subject position otherwise, if you can put it like that, or changing that subject position by using it? Yeah,
I briefly, it's like a little line in that paper, and I don't know whether I quite that was a speculative hypothesis I had. The shift from ODA, so the existing Indonesian term for person with AIDS, really is the translation of the term, orang hidup dengan AIDS, replaced very recently over the past year or two with ODIV, orang hidup or orang dengan HIV. a move that I suggest in a sense is mirroring this move towards an emphasis on invisibility through the implementation of widespread access to ART. And so, yeah, that's right. So ODIHR as a claim to political respectability is a recent one, but a fast-moving one. I mean, these terms kind of get picked up and start getting used in remarkably fast ways. So yeah, ODIHR is now the term de jure to be used in progressive and official settings. But yeah, you're right. Really reflects quite a distinctive posturing and claim to political visibility. But which is, even, I mean, the similarity of ODIHR to ODA, right, in the OD means that people, I think, will continue to imagine them along similar lines.
So I know we don't have much time left, but I got a 3-part STS question about viral visibility. So with cell counts in an Indonesian context, is that literally somebody with a microscope counting cells and a viewfinder? With PCR and viral loads, I'm imagining with COVID, there's been a proliferation of PCR, kits. So I'm wondering if that's radically changing, on a fast pace. And then in a sort of nightclub setting, are they using like lateral flow tests with blood, like we're used to with sort of like the COVID tests?
Yeah, that's right. Rapid testing.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So in terms of the last one, yeah, that's right. So rapid testing, but without access to then corresponding be able to provide treatment immediately. Although that was kind of, various trials were made to have treatment immediately available, but that's generally not the case. I mean, there's a corresponding overlay of like the fact that the nightclub where I did that is shut down due to, actually not due to the anti-LGBT panic, which you would expect, but due to COVID. The kind of economic downturn due to COVID meant that club has closed down. But in terms of, viral visibility in the Indonesian context, a CD4 count. So viral load testing is available, but very patchily. And really private labs are the place where you will gain access to that. And then CD4 is generally taken as a proxy for viral load. And indeed the government official guidelines, and maybe this is following the WHO as well, in best practice surveillance, uses CD4 as the third, often uses CD4 as the proxy for that third part of the cascade, the undetectable suppressed viral load.
But I guess what I was trying to get at is, do you know what the embodied practice of finding a CD4 positive T cell looks like in Indonesia? Is it someone with a light microscope, like counting cells, or is it something else?
That's a great question. I don't know. I'm sorry, but does anyone else know in the room? Do we have any lab technicians?
Not technicians. No, basically, like the viral load is you need to draw the blood and tested it under microscope or something to look at the virus count.
Or the cell count, I would imagine. The probably for the viral load, you would need a PCR machine.
Yeah, and it's more expensive in Indonesia. Like in comparison to the CD4, it could be like 600 rupiah, 1,000 more compared to CD4. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
But basically, it's like different purpose. Like CD4 is it's very old mechanism to detect your immune system. How many immune system do you have because of HIV? While the viral load is how many virus do you have in your body? So it can so that's why the term detectable or undetectable is just related to a viral load.
It could be a little fun project for somebody to follow the blood from the clinic to the laboratory and see how those numbers are mediated, and the images and machines, non-human agents.
Basically, your life determined by the machine. Congratulations, you're successful in your ARV treatment, and no, you failed.
Yeah. I do know, I think Indonesia got its first viral load machine, PCR, I guess, in I think it was 96. I think it was if that maps on. I mean, it was I think it was at the, there was a Dr. Zubairi, very famous Indonesian physician, managed to get access to a machine pretty early on, right? Well before testing or treatment were widely available for experimental purposes. But I'm guessing that was like the only machine available for many, many years.
And they've become a lot less expensive in recent years too. So, and yeah, just all over, like my sister is a clinician in the States and she has one in her office now. So it's affordable for, orang biasa, at least.
Yeah.
Dokter biasa, dokter umum.
Yeah. That's a great question though. And that's something I'll have to ask about when I'm back.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again, Ben. Thank you, Anne and Ferdi, for these stimulating comments, and Laura too. So lovely to see you all in the Zoom room, and hopefully someday in real life we will all have a chance to meet. So thank you very much, and feel free to come back to the reading group.
Thanks, Evan. Yeah, thanks, Evan.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye,
Anne-Marie and
everyone.
Ferdi.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Ben.
Bye.
See you soon.
See you soon.